Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all having a nice day. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone for attending today. A quick note before we begin, if you please silence your phones so they don't interrupt the speakers. That'd be nice. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for taking the time to come to this panel. Consequences of U.S. foreign policy have been devastating to countries across the globe, but these consequences are often overlooked, especially their ties to the events of May 4th. I'd like to especially extend our deepest gratitude to our panelists for agreeing to speak tonight and share their expertise. We have Dr. Tyner, Professor of Geography, and Dr. Joshua Stacher, Professor of Political Science. Could each of you please introduce yourselves and provide a brief overview of your research experience?
My name is Josh Stacher. I'm in the brand new School for Multidisciplinary Social Sciences and Humanities on the basement of Bowman. I'm a retired political scientist. My research areas are on the politics of the Middle East. I lived for 9 years in Egypt. I've made many trips to Israel and Palestine. I've published on both Egypt and Israel, Palestine, Syria. And I've looked at U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and other places.
Good evening. I'm Jim Tyner, Professor of Geography. I've been at Kent State now since 1997. My broad areas of research address questions of mass violence and genocide, specifically the Cambodian genocide, and more broadly, much of my work looks at U.S. foreign policy with respect to Southeast Asia, specifically with Vietnam and Cambodia.
Thank you for introducing yourself. As we're all likely aware, Kent State students were impelled to come out and protest on the day of May 4th because of President Nixon's decision to invade Cambodia. But backing up a bit, what was America doing in Vietnam in the first place? And what were the motivations to keep Vietnam U.S. friendly?
Okay. Collect my thoughts here on how best to approach this. So, the reasons for U.S. intervention in Vietnam and then also by extension with Laos and Cambodia think are traced to the immediate fallout of the Second World War. That the United States was taking the opportunity to expand what it called its strategic frontier. It recognized that it was in a position to shape global events, and that required the establishment of an archipelago of overseas military bases, and that put them on a perceived collision course with the Soviet Union, and after 1949 with China as well. At that point, it becomes a matter of strategic interest to determine which areas are considered or were considered vital for U.S. interests. Vietnam initially, going back to the Roosevelt administration, Indochina as the entities of that region were known, was not considered to be terribly strategic from a U.S. point of view. However, the United States had two main considerations when it came to that region. Number one was to support France, and for that you had to take a look at European geopolitics. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when U.S. foreign policy experts contemplated the likelihood of a Third World War, it was going to take place again, they anticipated, on Europe. Therefore, the relationships, specifically with France and then later on West Germany, were crucial to that. So the United States, certainly going back to Roosevelt, was not in support of the reimposition of European colonies. In fact, the United States was opposed to colonies not for altruistic reasons, but because they served as monopolies, and they would be markets and areas of resources denied access to the United States. The other component was that the United States also, as we moved into the late 1940s, wanted to have a strong Japan as a counterweight to China. And to have a strong Japan, Japan needed resources, they needed markets as well. Those were to ultimately come from Southeast Asia. So the United States, because of its obligations to France in support of European geopolitics and in support of Japan for its ability to industrialize during the Cold War and use those resources in Southeast Asia, the United States increasingly turned its attention towards the promotion and defense of South Vietnam.
Thank you. So, as you can from that, there's a very long history of imperial involvement in that region of the world. What has been the evolution of imperial tactics in Vietnam and across the entire world?
I'll go ahead and try to take a stab at that. I mean, essentially, the way that I see the international arena. So one of the things you hear when you listen to the news is they'll go on about a rules-based order. Like the reason why we have to get, involved in some ways with the Russia-Ukraine conflict is because we live in a rules-based order. And that means international law allows states to do some things and not the other. The problem when the conflict in Ukraine was started by Russia was that it was very interesting to see a lot of these commentators from Europe and the United States talking about a rules-based order, when in fact, not only has the United States and some of its most powerful allies, like the state of Israel, been under the international order. They were the architects of an arena that then they did not sign, like the covenant on child labor. They didn't sign the discrimination against all forms of violence against and discrimination against women. They obviously didn't sign up for the International Criminal Court, right? So it's this sort of dynamic, right, that the United States wants to tell everybody what they want to do, and they want to operate violently around the world. but in a way that it stops other actors in the arena from doing it, which is probably just enough bait for Putin to try to go ahead and do it, right? I mean, that I'm looking at. And what it looks like to me is a bunch of rich white states and a bunch of poor brown and black ones, and walls are going up, and mobility restrictions are happening, and climate change is happening, and the concentration of wealth is happening as well. States into this position of being like the lead counterinsurgent, right? And so then all dissent around the world, whether it's in Venezuela or Iraq or Afghanistan or China, right, it needs to be dealt with, right? And so not only do they use violence to put down dissent, they're now starting to use violence to put violence at every turn. Every nook and cranny of our existence is just one form of violence after another. And so when you look at the logic of violence, right, you get death, the opposite of life. And you know what happened in Vietnam, I was not alive for. I was born in 1975. But I lived in Egypt in the build-up to the war on Iraq and Afghanistan. For like a decade after the war started in Iraq, and we were ignored and told we were crazy and all, are the exact same arguments, right, that they're using now to kind of funnel money and funnel things in. And I think this is the dynamic. I saw a tweet this morning of like some underpass in Philadelphia. People shouldn't be living like this. And we're sending another $33 billion to Ukraine. So the more we go out and try to dominate the international political sphere, the more we're from our own services, our own care, our own educational systems, our own food sources, our own housing. There's enough money. It's just all spent on the machinery of death. So the biggest change is we're now the counterinsurgent. Everything gets designed in sort of counterinsurgency. Just like David Petraeus set up in Iraq when he wrote his Ph.D. dissertation at Princeton. He wrote a manual on how to run a counterinsurgency. This is U.S. policy.
Thank you for that, Dr. Steiner. I'm sorry. Stacher. You mentioned the racial aspect to imperialism, but I think many of us may already know the answer to this question, but why do you think individuals, people living within America or other countries, are more willing to protest and fight for Ukraine rather than Libya or Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I'm triggered by the whole thing. Like in my little, fortress suburb that I live in up by Cleveland, like I see Ukrainian flags like all over. Like my little kids are like, look, another Ukrainian flag. I'm just like, there's not that many Ukrainians in this city, right? And it's very hard to see, but essentially it boils down to the same thing, right? The United States is always claiming that it's out fighting for democracy or some sort of ideal out in the world, like when they lied in the lead up to Iraq. And these fighting for democracy abroad, which is always carried out by poor people anyway, this takes away from our material well-being. We can't be healthy, we can't be well, we can't be a community because of the policy of police killing black people. Right? I mean, this stuff does not stay there. That's why, things around foreign policy, we have to come up with a different strategy. To prepare for this, I sat around and I was thinking about Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence speech, which was delivered 55 years ago. And if you read it without context or not knowing the last 55 years have happened, it's a complete shit show. And then when you add on top of that, not just Guatemala, Peru, Thailand, Cambodia, Iran, but Ray Grandin has a book called Empire's Workshop. It came out right before the Iraq War. He details all what the United States is doing in Latin America in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? I could easily pick up the story there and narrate you all about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, right? And even places where the uprisings, the citizen uprisings that happened in 2011, like Bahrain, were completely and utterly destroyed, and they were surrounding hospitals and going in and killing doctors so they couldn't treat people that were wounded. We were calling this thing the kingdom of tear gas because that's the only thing that was happening in Bahrain. So, I think that what happens when we have these uprisings against this and the response from the counter-revolutionary states, which all states are counter-revolutionary, it's really about dismantling a way of life for people. Their families, their villages, their communities, their crop, food, and sort of pushback from the social wing. Like, no help is coming from above in these politicians. Like, they're just going to lead us further down this dark spiral of this night of death and violence. And for me, I can sit here and I can narrate to you all the different ways that this world is messed up. But the problem is, I think we have enough information now. We need to actually come up with more strategy. Like, what are the people in this room going to do? How are we going to be with each other? Right? What's it look like? Because otherwise, we're just being led down a sort of cavern over a cliff into co-annihilation with the rest of the world. Or at least maybe the best it's going to be is just a bunch of rich people behind their walls and sea walls and with their private security guards and their rocket ships, and then like the rest of us trying to figure it out. This stuff is all connected, right? You can't talk about U.S. and Vietnam without talking about U.S. outside and then also sort of at home. Sorry, I have a tendency to swallow the microphone.
So, how does the United States use foreign aid and food aid and conversely sanctions as a tool to influence other nations?
So, when it comes to questions of food aid and food trade, the first thing to understand is that the United States does not use either or altruistic. First established under public law 480 was designed as a Cold War strategy to gain influence and to exert foreign power. There was a domestic component to it, certainly to respond to surplus crises within the agrarian capitalist sector. But the other component was to exert power. And the United States would use foreign food aid as a means of trying to extort other countries or to fund particularly right-wing governments to align with U.S. foreign and military strategies.
How did the war in Vietnam shape America's foreign policy today and the conflicts we occasion?
I think that I think there's a danger, as Josh says, that we don't want to just look at Vietnam, the U.S. war in Vietnam as an operation. That there was a continuity from the mid-1940s onward as the United States made a conscious decision to shape the world to its own benefit. This is not, I should repeat, not to shape it in its own image. It was not trying to promote U.S. values abroad or to make other countries imitations of the United States, because American exceptionalism wouldn't allow that. When we're talking about the rules-based order of the international community, we have to recognize that the United States is the the dominant international institutions, including the United Nations, these were specifically constructed to benefit the United States. And if you read the documentation, if you read the transcripts, if you look at the Security Council memorandums that Truman, Eisenhower, or Johnson initiated, it has always been very clear that these rules are to protect U.S. global interests, and to the extent that they no longer protect U.S. interests, they are not going to abide by those rules. The United States has always maintained itself in a state of exception, whereby it is included through its exclusion in terms of international law. This is why the United States can condemn other countries for using cluster bombs, and yet we retain the right to continue to use cluster bombs if we so choose. So there's always been this contradictory component to U.S. foreign policy, and much of it crystallized in Vietnam. It is not unique to Vietnam. In Korea leading up to it, and we can see it particularly with Reagan and Central America in the 1980s afterwards. I think that there's a lot more that we can say about that and some of the particulars of that U.S. military foreign policy.
Oh yeah, no, the United States doesn't want $1 of aid to leave this country that doesn't have some sort of interest attached to it. Professor Tyner said, the U.S. doesn't really sort of push its values overseas. And this has always kind of been one of the things, we used to do this in Egypt when I was a graduate student. Every time U.S. has to come up against its interest and its values, it chooses its interests. After you choose your interest every time, I think we can pretty much come down to the idea that that is your value, right? That is what you value, right? And in a way,
You won't let the other countries share that value.
oh, of course not. But this is the other thing, right? If we're leaving this to the state to figure out what our collective values are, we are all screwed, right? And I think that the reimagining has to happen from places like universities and friend groups and coffee shops and all the places where people are meeting and talking about their lives, right? Because states, they don't have that. Since World War II, knocking over everything, and now when we look at India, right? Or we look at sort of Myanmar, or we look at other places in the developing world, they're starting to kind of adopt these zero-sum policies on their populations that revolve around mass incarceration, restrictions on mobility, and so forth, right? And so this is the model that we send around the world. In the case of in Egypt, right? Currently in Egypt, so there was a coup in 2013. It's almost 10 years old, and currently in Egypt, there's 106,000 people in prisons. They've built 19 new prisons since 2013, and they estimate between 55 and 62,000 people in Egyptian prisons are political prisoners. This is the model. They're just going to start throwing everybody in jail if they just can't outright kill them. And in a place like Egypt, right, it's prelude. We can see it happening before it gets here, because the system is so much weaker there, right? And so, I think that what we really have to think about is this global authoritarian right-wing order of places like Hungary and the Philippines, and that maniac in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and the maniac in Russia, Putin, and so forth, right? But this is the thing, it's not really that much of a mystery. We can see this if you're paying attention. And Professor Tyner and I were joking before this thing started. The reason why they're coming after critical race is because universities are the places that have the people that have the receipts on all the bad shit that's been going on. That's why it's a problem. Right? So everybody needs to kind of decide where they're going to come down on this, and who they want to be, and how they want to educate, and what they want to know, from what perspective. because we can't really rely on our own government to lead in that way. At least it can't lead in a way that we can have, in turn, ethical lives.
Nice taste across the world.
Exponentially.
Woo! Mike Davis has this amazing book called, I forget what the book's called, but the one chapter in the book is called Fortress LA. And it talks about like all the stuff that's happening in LA to like control populations, move populations, jail populations. And I've been having my students read it and they're just horrified. And then I tell them like, that was written in 1989. And what's going on is way more sophisticated than this right now. So, I mean, I think everything in America is up to potentially being policed. Before we started this semester, we had a town hall, is that what they call it? Where they were talking about why we had to go back to the classroom, blah, 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 blah. And, the thing about it is that we said, well, what happens if the students don't wear the mask? Like, what happens then? Someone just doesn't want to comply. And they told us, well, call the cops. What? I'm not calling the cops on my students. Like, the solution to every problem on this campus is not call the cops. All right? So, I mean, and I think that this university is not that special, right? It's everywhere, right? Somebody does something in your neighborhood, they call the cops. It's like a helpline, right? And so, I mean, the securitization, the cameras everywhere, like, what are people scared of? The guns everywhere. Right? I mean, yeah, I mean, everybody's a deputized police officer.
Back in the 60s, how did President Johnson perpetuate the war in Vietnam by lying about the Geneva Accords?
Geneva and also Tonkin and various other. That's obviously a fairly complex question. It deals with both domestic politics and also U.S. politics. And I think one of the things to think about here is to dispel the notion that there are actually two parties or two political parties in the United States, that it's a fairly blurred line between Democrats and Republicans. The rhetoric may be strongly differentiated, but in terms of practice, I don't think there's a hell of a lot of difference between the two. Johnson, I think, is a interesting character. Johnson, of course, had his own agenda. He wanted to put forward the Great Society. Depending on the historian you want to talk to, he was not terribly enthralled with the idea of pursuing Vietnam. Now, I think that to understand Johnson's decisions that he made, and particularly his escalation in the crucial months at the end of 1964 into 1965, of course, those are covered on the context of Kennedy's decisions. And Kennedy is making his decisions based on decisions that Eisenhower made. Eisenhower's making decisions based especially on what Truman was making there. And so I think for me, it's sort of difficult to just stand back and say, oh, this is what Johnson was doing, and not take into consideration the continuity and the accumulation of those decisions. That, and the fact that Johnson's decisions were made in the context of trying to deal with a Congress that certainly in the 1960s, with a couple of exceptions, was very much in support of the war itself. So, in terms of the actual sort of deception that's being used on this, again, Johnson was not unique. The United States, going back with Truman, and particularly from NC 68 and the National Security Act of 1947, the The United States has always disguised its foreign policy and under fairly empty euphemisms. The United States has always been very clear that foreign policy is military policy and military policy is foreign policy. They use what I refer to in my classes, not to get too academic in all of this, but when we talk about empty signifiers. All this simply means is, when we think about sign systems, you think of a stop sign, okay? We see the big red octagon that says stop, and we know to stop, okay? It has a meaning that's associated with it. The United States foreign policy relishes empty signifiers. So we go to war over things like freedom. You know, we can take a philosophy class, there's going to be a billion different definitions and understanding of what actually constitutes freedom. You know, I ask my students, what is freedom? Because you're being called upon to fight for something as ambiguous as freedom. But it works. And if we look at the policies, and if we look at the education, Josh is talking about coming for academics and coming for universities. Because the universities are the ones who are calling this stuff out. It's not the media, certainly not now anymore. It's the academics. It's the universities that are calling attention to these lies, that are trying to inform the students, the ones who will be on the front lines, that what the government is telling you is not accurate. That I look at the education that my daughters received from K through 12, and they learn this definition. Oh, capitalism is wonderful, free market. Again, we don't talk about that free isn't the free market. And then they learn, communism. Communism is bad. Well, what makes communism bad? Well, they can't tell you because they don't know. Because they don't know what socialism is, they don't know what communism is, and frankly, they don't even know what capitalism is, because these aren't being taught, but they're being bandied about as these powerful words to justify U.S. intervention. Johnson was remarkable at it, Kennedy was remarkable at it, Nixon was really remarkable at it, but so too was Eisenhower and Truman. So it's a continuity, and they're all playing by the same playbook throughout the process.
How has the United States used covert operations and the CIA to influence other regimes?
So I'll start off with the historical. We can bring it up more recently. That I think this is where you do start to see a lot of the practices that the United States uses in both covert and clandestine operations are really grounded in the Vietnam conflict. This is not to say that we did not have covert operations prior to that. We certainly did with the precursor to the CIA, with the OSS in World War II, and to a limited extent also during the Korean War. But the target was very different. And by the time we get into both the Nixon and the Johnson administration, this was really a more effective arm that the United States could use to project its foreign power and to utilize various methods to influence other countries or to overthrow other countries. Many of the technologies that we subsequently have used, many of the surveillance strategies that we've subsequently used, many of them were really founded upon the efforts of individuals like McNamara and Rostow during the 1960s.
I mean, yeah, the precursor to the CIA, I mean, the best advice, the best anecdote I can share with you, right, is what happened in Iran in 1953, right? Iran had a parliament since 1906. They had the fairest elections in the Middle East. Mohammed Mossadegh was elected in 1951, and they nationalized the it's basically Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, it's BP. The United States had like multiple coup plans. Like they said, they were just going to send wave after wave of different coups to break them. And so Mohammed Mossadegh ends up in prison. The Shah ends his way back up in Iran. He creates a police state for the next 20 years while buying a bonanza of American arms. And it leads to revolution, and the response from America is like, why doesn't Iran like us? Right? Because they have no knowledge of what happened in 1953. Whereas every single human being that's coming out into the Iran, like the reason why they use violence, right? If you drop a bomb on something, it disorganizes everything, life, right? And so, essentially, this is what people across the developing world have been experiencing since the 55 years since MLK gave that speech. And the last thing I'll say is that, like, look, it's not just the U.S., right? I mean, the United States has a long history of like sending stuff that doesn't really work to Israel, and then Israel like jazzes it all up. And like, really, like, you want some tear gas that'll melt somebody? Like, watch this. Oh, and we test this on live human beings, which means they test it on occupied Palestinians. And then they'll sell that tear gas to, like, Narendra Modi in India, right? So the transnational diffusion of all this stuff, right? The New York City Police Department has a permanent office in Tel Aviv. New York City has an enormous problem with, like, broken windows policing, stop and frisk. Where are they learning this? Derek Chauvin, when he put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, what police officers in the world teach you to kneel on somebody's neck like that? It's Israel. No, I'm not going to sit here and say Israel is the bane of everything, but they're not helping, right? They're basically coming up with like facial recognition, different ways of caging and warehousing human beings, right? And the world's watching. Right? So, I think this is why I'm much more concerned about the global authoritarian right. We're losing sort of East versus South. It's the only thing we can do to stop it. And it'll happen in India, and it's going to happen in other places. Right? So, I think it's the St. Louis about skunk water. Skunk water, that's what they use whenever there's protests in the West Bank. Right? So, I mean, like, they're all learning off each other, and it's just, I remember when they were protesting Gaza a couple years ago, Gazans showed up for 74 Fridays in a row to ask for the blockade against Gaza to stop, and the Israelis kept shooting them in the legs. So you can get all these pictures of like all these amputees now because they were using those bullets that explode when they hit your flesh. And so Palestinians, at some point, they had a drone, and they flew the drone up over this border wall thing and flew it over top of the crowd and then dropped tear gas. And I remember seeing that live and going like, oh, that's definitely coming to an American city near you. Right? So, the security apparatus, the policing apparatus, like, it's got to go. We don't need police. They're a new way of controlling society. And they're broke. And they won't listen.
That's some very powerful stuff. Thank you. And the U.S. it funds hate groups as well, doesn't it?
Probably. The U.S. probably is a hate group. Joking, like, people don't. Right? They don't have the ability to craft the narrative anymore over this. And so we're going to head into one of these things, like in the 1960s, where the street and the state are going to get into a fight. coming. I can feel it.
So, going back to Vietnam War, as we know, Nixon's announcement of the invasion of Cambodia is what ignited a lot of college campuses, including Kent State. But why?
Nixon's decision to authorize troops into Cambodia was not, strictly speaking, an expansion of the war, because the war was already in Cambodia. For years, the United States conducting covert operations, bringing war out into the open. Now, the question of why Cambodia, and I think why Cambodia is moving into the 21st century, is that if you read the works by Shawcross and others, Cambodia is described as a sideshow, that the main conflict was in Vietnam, and oh, by the way, we have this other little entity over here, Cambodia, we can include Laos as well. The United States did not give a damn about Cambodia. Cambodia wasn't even a pawn in this chess war. At best, it was part of the chessboard itself. The United States, from 1954 onwards, their sole objective was to maintain, to create, because it never existed, it was an artificial entity, was to create a South Vietnam. That was the objective. The objective was never to defeat North Vietnam. It was never to occupy North Vietnam. It was never to unify all of Vietnam as a pro-Western state. It was to maintain South Vietnam as a sovereign country with its own territorial integrity. The problem is you had an emergency, and you also then had the ability of the NVA to move troops and materials through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. The United States needed to solidify the boundaries of South Vietnam to maintain South Vietnam as an independent country. Because of the porosity of the borders with Cambodia and Laos, the United States had to engage in military operations. Under Johnson, these were covert operations, because Cambodia, or Laos has its own history to it. Cambodia was a sovereign state, and it was a declared neutral state. Now, were the North Vietnamese in there? Yes, they were, but two wrongs don't make a right. And so the United States was trying to do what it can to shore up this southwestern border between Vietnam and Cambodia. Once the United States moves in after 1970 with Nixon's authorization of what he called the incursion, the United States never supported, was never interested in trying to maintain Cambodia as a pro-Western state. They were willing to bring back Sihanouk. They were willing to let any other person come into place. They did not have to support, or were not prepared to support, ultimately, the Lon Nol government. In fact, at that point, they would be happy if it was simply a neutral state anyways to offset South Vietnam. So they went in, had nothing to do with Cambodia, had no exit plan for Cambodia, had no desire, no intention of trying to build up, maintain, protect, defend, secure anything with Cambodia. Proxy is the way that the United States is going to chew up other countries in the process of achieving goals in other countries themselves. And so, it isn't so much that we have to look at how the U.S. those relations focus happens to be. So that's how I understand it.
Alright, so I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll move into audience Q&A. So, start and off, hold on, why do you think it's important to discuss U.S. foreign policy in the context of May 4th?
I'm going to answer your question by telling a story. So in 2015 or so, I invited one of my Egyptian friends, his name's Sharif Abdul-Qaddous, he's a journalist, to give a talk at Kent State, and he came. And I was doing a lot of programming at the time, and I would bring all my invited guests. I would take them to the May 4th Visitor Center, I would take them around the grounds, especially for some of my older folks that would come in. They really were interested in this stuff. The younger people were like, oh, okay, that's an interesting historical tidbit. So Sharif came, and he was interesting. He went through the whole May 4th thing, and then we walked outside, and I said, what'd you think? And he went, all this for 4 people? I said, yeah. He went, I can't drive from one end of Cairo to another and go, there's 4 there, 13 there, over 1,000 in this square, 300 over here. Like, he's like, my entire city is a memorial. And so I think that is the link that I want to make to May 4th, that the right to protest and the right to go against your government for unethical reasons, something that if we don't practice it, it will atrophy. And you know, the first time I saw a protest, I was born a child of the 90s. And Clinton had just bombed a pharmaceutical company in Sudan and tents in Afghanistan. And I was a student at the American University in Cairo, and like all my Egyptian friends were basically like, we're going to go protest. I said, protest what? The U.S. bombing. And I kind of knew I wasn't supposed to be in the protest. So one of my Egyptian friends took me to the top of the library, and we looked up, and I watched, you know, students come off campus. Busy. Because I mean, I've never seen a protest, at least something big. So I don't know what we need to do, but we need to protest more than one day, like, you know, Women's March, and then it's over. In identity politics, because it's not going to go anywhere if we stay in our pockets. It's too easy to carve up. So those are how I would think about U.S. foreign policy in May 4th. When I think of May 4th, I think about all the street protests around the world that are happening right now, where people are getting killed or whatever. What happens to us? But I can't be on that side and just sit there and watch it.
I would just make a couple of comments, and obviously there's politics surrounding what May 4th means. From my standpoint, one of the questions that led Mindy and I to write our book on Kent State and Cambodia is precisely the fact that, you know, a lot of students know that the protests had something to do with Vietnam, and possibly they knew something about Cambodia, but of course they don't know why Cambodia, but they also don't know what happened to Cambodia afterwards. And they don't know about the hundreds of thousands of deaths that came about as a result of U.S. military operation. They don't know that the United States supported the Khmer Rouge, those responsible for the genocide during the 1970s and all through the 1980s. That the United States and China both supported the Khmer Rouge to retain their seat at the United Nations, and implicitly the United Nations supported this genocide. And the fact that nobody wanted to talk about the genocide in the United States for over 30 years because of the complicity of the United States, of Britain, of Thailand, of Japan, of France, and a host of other countries that led to the death and destruction that killed at least a quarter of the population within Cambodia. So there's that part of Cambodia that I think really has to come to the fore when we talk about May 4th. But the other thing is, you know, to build upon your friend's comment that, you know, all of this before death. And, you know, certainly, you know, with the millions of dead in Cambodia, I can sympathize with that position. But the other thing that I've realized over the 25 years that I've been here at Kent State is that it is largely the students who have kept May 4th alive.
That's right.
And it is because of all of foreign policy under a microscope, or at least it opens the possibility to have it under the microscope, so that we can question. Now, I'm very respectful of those who want to think about May 4th as to the events that happened on May 4th and the experiences of those who survived May 4th on that day. But I personally think that is an opportunity that we can stand back and ask ourselves, what does this mean when the United States engages in these illegal military operations? What does it mean when you have students and citizens protesting these illegal activities and getting gunned down for that? And the fact that these processes and these practices are not going away, they are deepening. When we talk about the surveillance, when we talk about against speech, when we talk about free.
Thank you so much for speaking. Now we're going to move into our audience Q&A portion. So if people have questions, they can just go ahead and raise their hands, and we'll have someone come around to you with the mic.
So why is it that they choose to answer nonviolent protests with violence?
I mean, I don't know, but I mean, dress it up in the New York Times in a way that's palatable, or they can't really deliver on the demands that the people are asking for in the street, right? And so, while the murders on this campus were extreme, right? I mean, we've seen this sort of proliferate across the United States, across the world. Like I mean, they only have one move, right? And we saw it when the budget appropriations came up again this year. Another $30 or $50 billion worth of military. Like we have $800 billion goes to our military. And you know, we wonder why our students don't understand history, or why, you know, everybody has some sort of health ailment or something like that. Because the bombs that got dropped on places like Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya, they don't just land on their targets, right? They land on our society. They break our society. This is a broken society because of all this. And if we want to kind of redo this, it has to happen outside of the specter of the state. The state is not going to reform itself. It's not going to fix itself. It has to be challenged. And I know for one, I'm not interested in challenging the most violent state in the history of the planet to a fight. I want to make that state do something it can't do, which is deal with the nonviolent protest. And I don't mean like pacifist, I mean instigating and baiting them, right?
I would answer that possibly a little bit more simply. The state uses violence because of fear and terror. That's right. It's effective. That fear and terror ultimately result in shooting individuals. Structural violence is just as effective. And of course, the United States ties jobs with healthcare. You know, we're one of the few damn countries that does that. And that is a form of terror that keeps people in a position of dependency that you're not going to overthrow the economic system because you're going to die from it. And even beyond that, the United States has, over the last 20-some years, been very creative in ways of profiting off lack of health, known as janitors' insurance or dead peasants' insurance, okay? Where corporations like Walmart and others will take out a life insurance policy on you. And there was back in the 2000s, there was sort of a Wild West type of attitude in terms of not very many restrictions taking place on this. Basically, if you were an employee of Walmart, they take out a life insurance policy on you and you die, they'll benefit off that because they hold part of that life insurance. And they would even hold on to it even if you quit and no longer work at Walmart. They would keep that life insurance policy. Now, if we are moving to a situation in capitalism today, which I think we are, it is more profitable because of life insurance than it died to begin with. So whether we're talking about economic violence, we're talking about physical violence, literally shooting people in the streets, it is all done to keep people down so that they won't protest, so that they won't speak up, and they will remain a blind state. And in terms of the U.S. military budget, it's not just the defense budget. If you count up all of the 700 plus military bases we have around the world, if you count all of the logistics that go into the maintenance of those 700 in the world, if you talk about all
Jim, I just wanted to add one point out, that repression that you spoke of was not effective here, because the protests continued in the fall of 1970, into the spring of 1971, into the fall of 1971, and throughout the spring of 1972, and indeed went on this campus until the Vietnam War came to an end.
And I think that's another important story that ties in.
And knowing that it's important for the reasons that you just pointed out, but it also went against the established narrative that existed for a very long period of time, that the shootings were effective on this campus, when in point in fact they were not.
That's right.
Because people came back regardless. And even when large numbers of students were indicted on top of the shootings, people fought through those indictments. And they also fought through the use of rubber bullets in 1971 and 1972. And I have friends who still have scars on their backs from the use of those rubber bullets. And the people went out anyway. And in fact, some of the protests, the ones in 1972, were larger than the one that was on the campus on May 4th, 1970. We had 4,000 people in front of Rockwell Hall after Hanoi and Haiphong were being bombed in the spring of 1972.
Those are great points, and I take them on. I mean, I guess in some of the cases I've seen, whether they're in Palestine or in Egypt, right, repression is so one after these sorts of things. But I take your point on, but you're right. I think, Kabir, do you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and yet and still in 2018 we have 600 armed cops on campus. Right?
We are.
And if our response on this campus, as Josh has said, is, oh, just call the cops. Let's just bring the police in. We're inviting. And as we see fighting for Trump, the very ones that are from that rally on our campus are protected by the cops.
That's right.
While Black Lives Matter and Antifa are targeted. So I think that it's a little rosy to think about the political landscape under terms of continued success in this struggle. I mean, there's real repression that happens right here.
Absolutely.
And we sit back and condone it.
Such an important point. Thank you so much, Rick. It's super. You know, it makes me think of something even more sinister, too. Like, if you think back to, like, the Afghani war of the 1980s, like, basically, U.S. policy was like, open it up, but contain it, dump a bunch of weapons, let everybody kill each other. Okay. Iran, Iraq, 1980 to 1988, same thing. You open the space, you let people go in, you let them kill each other. I mean, the United States was at war with Iran and sending them money and sending them weapons through Israel, right? I mean, it's so crazy. And then if you look at sort of Iraq, same dynamic. They pop open this crater like they did in Cambodia, create a vacuum, and then like you get something like ISIS. right? And so, you know, you get these movements and how it's all connected. And right now, it just feels like Ukraine is the same thing. They got Putin in there. He's overwhelmed. They're going to like contain him, hold him in there, but they don't really care about what's going to happen to people that are dispossessed and made refugees and lose people and become orphans and all the rest of this stuff. And like, that's the trauma that we got to deal with on the back end, right? Because our government is participating in ways that is destroying community, family, and making people more nihilistic, because what else do they got to lose? Right? So it's just creating these vacuums and then the sort of managing, like, let them all bleed out, right? While we dump weapons in. And it's a pattern. It happens all over the place. Yes?
So you guys pointed out several times that there's an obvious history of American involvement with foreign nations that is not a good look on America itself. What do you think, apart from the Ukraine situation right now, what do you think is going on in the world that we need to be aware of before it gets hit by time in the United States?
I have no idea. I can't predict the future.
No.
Can I answer that?
What?
The destruction of the small farmer.
Okay, yeah.
A lot of the food aid going over after World War II resulted in the destruction of the whole small farm economy. And that's what's going on now in America with all the food that's flooding. And small farmers getting that, going that.
No, I agree. I think that a major part of it is, again, the U.S. catering to agribusinesses, etc., and they pay lip service to the legitimate farmers and so on, but they don't really care. In terms of broad geopolitics, the areas that certainly we can lose sleep over, South China Sea, the Spratly Islands, and by extension, Taiwan. China is watching intently with what the United States is doing with respect to Russia. And the way that Russia is dealing with Ukraine, China has not given up its aspirations to go into Taiwan. And so they're watching and waiting to see what we do there. I think to an extent we've already played our hands because we don't care what's going on in the far west of China with the Uyghur. But that's certainly a flashpoint there.
I guess I would answer that by asking it like, or looking at it from the other way, right? Like if we would take a just like put all, like let's look at the places that like Britain bombed, in France, in Germany, in Belgium, right? I mean, and the map is just covered for the last European, the Dutch and the East India Company invading Indonesia. So, I mean, like, that's the thing to me that, like, what do we have to look, what do we, like, I mean, completely changed world from the Enlightenment view of things, because it's all basically a lie anyway.
I think I'll just add one thing to that. I don't have a perfect answer, but it's something that scares the hell out of me. That I try not to spend a lot of time on sort of speculatives and what ifs, and drawing historical parallels is always kind of concerning. But if you look at the events that happened in 1914, the fact that nobody thought a world war is going to come out of this, and if there was a conflict, it's going to be over by Christmas time. The way that you are seeing countries respond to Russia and Ukraine in terms of providing assistance and so forth, and the informal alliances outside of NATO and the EU, the informal alliances that are coming about, this can really spiral out of control very quickly. If Putin or somebody decides that they want with, I don't know if I was president what the hell I would do. I think that there damn well should be some sort of response if Putin is going to be using nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean that I want nuclear war, but there has to be something there. The problem is, how is the United States going to respond given the fractured nature of our game politics to begin with? Because Biden could put forward the most level-headed policy, and yet over if you had the current configuration of Congress today in World War II. So, I mean, not to say that we were perfect in World War II either, but my point, the way that the United States is going to be able to conduct its foreign policy, that's scary.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about the role of media and like quelling political dissent. So what do you think about that?
The United States is, I think, Fox News, it's pretty clear what they're doing. They are supporting, we talked about, is the United States government supporting white supremacist groups and others. Fox News is, we know that. It is the white supremacist network there. But frankly, the New York Times is no better. They're capitalizing of all of it. The New York Times is some sort of liberal media is BS. So, I just see dark times ahead, frankly, in terms of the media.
I don't have a road here. Yes, ma'am.
So, how do you see the student body here at the university in terms of concerns about this? And just because we're reflecting on May 4th, and what's the role of you fellas as faculty? And I mean, there are many good faculty. What yourselves as faculty? Are you interchanging with students about?
I'll make a couple of comments to that, Josh. First off, I do want to clarify, this wasn't the intended body of this panel, having two white guys up here. There were a number of other people who were invited that didn't look like us. One of them broke their legs, etc. And so, unfortunately, we're the two here right now. My general sense is that, first off, the students here are not apolitical, they're not apathetic. I don't think that they've had a lot of good guidance. I don't think that they know necessarily where to look. I think that they're a product, and I'm trying to be respectful of K-12 educators. My aunt was a K-12 educator. Our educational system prior to university is woefully deficient in the sense of teaching critical thinking skills. And so my experience when the students come into the classrooms, they don't know how to think, they don't know how to ask questions. And it is a challenge to sort of get them to open up and to actually think about things. In terms of how we approach it, yeah, I mean, Josh and I have talked for years, and various others, not just us, of course, how to approach this, how we can interact with the university, with the administration, the support that is there. It's an ongoing discussion. I'll let Josh fill in some of the blanks here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess for me, this semester I had a class of largely freshmen, a bunch of them were here, and I had a class of seniors. And the seniors had had me multiple times, and so the classroom was completely different than my introduction level class. I got a lot of stares, like what is happening, what are we doing here? Also, normal times aren't here, and so people are handling the transition pretty difficultly. But I'll say this. And I thought this as soon as the pandemic started to happen and we were kind of holed up in the house, is well, every generation we say well, they're going to be the ones that sort of fix it. And then, they get mortgages and then they start droning people in, Middle Eastern countries for fun. And I think that in this case, it might actually be different because there was a big structural disruption. What I notice in my classes is my students really don't care that much about what they're going to do for a living. I mean, it's out there, mainly because of the pressure from their parents. I think, and pressure from society. But generally speaking, I find that my students, my undergraduates, they're caring, they're open, they want to hear different points of view. They want to kind of go and explore, and they don't really have that many adult role models that have like structural analysis or you know, that can help them. I mean, the reason I'm a professor is I grew up in a house without any structural analysis. I couldn't ask any historical question and get it like put into a larger story that made sense. So I just kept going to school and I read this stuff till, I mean, eventually it sort of took 20 years, but it clicked. Right? But, and I think that's the thing. I mean, very few of our students have structural analysis. They don't have a sense of history. They don't understand where they fit in. And I don't think it's anything, you know, terrible or awful or evil intent. I don't think their parents know. They're not being taught. No one's being taught this, right?
But yet you're here, STS convened this panel to happen, so there is certainly some groundwork here. And how does the faculty interface with that?
The microphone's on here.
I can say.
Well.
There are 600 police.
It's about 600 faculty too.
Unfortunately, I think, there are some very concerned faculty, and by no means we aren't the only two, and frankly, there's probably a lot of people who should know this better other than us. Just speaking for myself, though, I'm able to do this because of the position that I have within the department. You know, I'm a senior faculty, I'm a full professor. And that gives me a certain amount of leeway in terms of the courses that I offer and the content of those courses there. Unfortunately, I think that there are too many faculty, and I'm trying to be respectful of my institution. I think that there are too many of my faculty who are simply indifferent. It's not so much that you have opposition, you have late right-wing that are serving the university. Here,
I'm a senior faculty member too. I'm a full professor too. I've been speaking out for a while, and I concur. I mean, there's just not that many. The idea, so there's two funny myths about college professors, right? One is that we can like talk to our students and like plant ideas in their brains and like mind control them, which is super cool because I have a 6 and an 8-year-old and I want to learn how to extend mind control to my 6 and 8-year-old because I have none of it with them. And then secondly, you know, there's this sort of other idea that like it's all a bunch of crazy radicals, and the fact of the matter is that a lot of professors treat this like a job. They come in, they teach, they go home. That's it. And that's their choice, and that's fine. But the one advantage that we have right now, Professor Tyner and I, as full professors, is nobody can tell us what to do in our classrooms. So America can be a mess, but you walk in my classroom and you get a different experience. And it's open, and it's safe, and it's cooperative, and it's grounded in research, and it's grounded on students deciding who they want to be and how they want to be in this world.
and that's why Texas and South Carolina and Florida are trying to overturn too.
That's right. If I was teaching people how to run regressions so they could get a job making $32,000 a year, that I would have not a problem in my life. No one would even notice me. In terms of the administration. Now they just...
Well, thank you everyone for the questions.
Oh, we got more?
Oh, no, I mean, if you want to end it, you can end it.
Well, do you
Go ahead.
answer?
Okay,
Go ahead.
well,
This will have to
obviously, before I say my question, Russia has, under no circumstances has the right to invade a sovereign nation like Ukraine. That's imperialism. But I would say, or I guess I'm asking, would you guys say that NATO kind of being this militant hand of the United States, do you think that they kind of threatened Russia, especially when we didn't really engage in full-hearted diplomacy? We kind of said, oh, all of your concerns are non-starters. Absolutely not. So I guess I would say, is this kind of like, non-diplomatic, almost saber-rattling, kind of lead us to be in part responsible for the invasion of Ukraine?
My take on it, and dealing with immigrant grandchildren who have access to what's going on the ground in Ukraine today. My initial reaction is that Putin is responsible for the invasion of Ukraine. It doesn't do any good to go and claim that NATO or the United States or anybody else impelled Russia to do that, forced Russia to do that. No, Russia chose to. How the United States responds, how NATO responds, how the EU responds, that's a different issue. But I don't think that you can hold NATO responsible for Putin's aggression.
About that. I mean, I think that the U.S. and NATO and the EU were deliberately provocative. But I mean, it is politics, right? I mean, we are allowed to have some sort of conflict. The idea behind politics is you have conflict that you can kind of resolve without bombing everybody back and forth. And so, yeah, I hold the same thing, but I think Putin invades Ukraine precisely because the United States and its allies have done whatever they wanted for the last 70 years. And so now that the United States isn't so top dominant militarily and like it was in the 90s, or like, so they can see it faltering, and so we're seeing what's happening. Putin's seeing what's happening. But if you have an actual rules-based order, Putin can't invade without the costs being high. But because it's like a pick or mix, follow whatever you want to respect kids' rights, respect them. If you don't, that's fine too. I mean, it's not really an order, which is essentially what people are revolting against. It's very interesting. So for those in the room that don't know, Egypt has gotten the largest amount of aid from the U.S. since 1979, the year they signed their peace agreement with Israel, Camp David Accords. And so Egypt has racked up around $60 billion in aid since 1979. You couldn't have had more of a puppet government under Mubarak with the U.S. interests and these sorts of things. It was super telling to me that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Egyptian state was not critical of Russia. They didn't back the United States. And so I asked some friends in Cairo, like, what's going on? And they said, oh, they like dealing with Russia. I said, why do they like dealing with Russia? Because when you call, they clear your ships out of the way. Right? And so, I think that this moment of sort of U.S. defections, right? I mean, are defecting away from America, waiting to see what's going to happen. We're going to see more and more of this. But, you get the kind of international order that you create, and we've created this.
A couple of things before we wrap up. SDS is doing more events this week for May 4th. We have a panel tomorrow that's in a very similar structure to this. The topic is on community policing. We have other groups here from Cleveland who've been getting issues done, like issue 24. We also have some speakers like Terry Gilbert, a people's lawyer, and Zola Zanya, who was on death row for 25 years but is finally free. He's going to be speaking. And hello, he's here in the audience. Some information on our group. Thank you all for attending and your questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you again for our speakers, our panelists.